I am making a patchwork dress today, which I am very excited about, and it's gonna be really easy, honestly. But sometimes, even with the easy stuff, I feel like it's helpful just to kind of see someone else's process so you don't second guess yourself. So I'm gonna show you how I'm gonna go about this project, and you can take from it what you will. I am going to be using a dress pattern today called the Skyline Dress, which is one of my patterns. And the dress itself is not necessarily patchwork, I'm just hacking it to be a patchwork dress. So you could probably take these principles and apply them to other patterns that you have as well. So basically, this dress has 3 sections to it. It has the bodice, the top tier of the skirt, and the bottom tier of the skirt. So the way that I'm gonna think about it is like 3 tubes of fabric. So like the bottom tube of fabric is the longest and the widest, and then there's the middle tube and then the top tube, kind of like tiers of a cake. And so all I'm going to do is decide how many sections I want in each tube or tier, and then I'm going to cut rectangles of fabric to make up each tube. So what I've decided to do is I want fairly big chunks, like big patches. I'm not doing like teeny tiny patches this time. So for the bottom tube of fabric, I'm going to have 5 fabrics because the middle tube is going to have 4 fabrics. So it's basically going to be 2 patches in the front and 2 in the back in the middle tier. So I wanted the bottom tier to have 5 because I want them to be kind of mismatched. I don't want any like seams to line up. So if I had like 6, it would be like 3 in the front, 3 in the back, but the side seam would still be the same. But I wanted it all to be kind of like off kilter. So the middle tier will have 4 rectangles and the bottom tier will have 5, so that none of the vertical seams are gonna match up. They're all gonna be offset. And then for the bodice, which is like the top tube of the dress, I'm also going to do 4 panels, but I'm going to offset them so that there's no middle seam. So basically the front bodice, 2/3 of it will be one fabric and 1/3 will be another. And then same with the back, I'll have 2/3 and 1/3. So the side seams will still match up for the bodice and top tier, but the center seams will be offset. And I basically decided this by laying out all of the fabrics that I had. I had a bunch of fat quarters from Fableism. So I'm using a lot of those, but they weren't quite big enough for the bottom tier of the skirt. So I had to substitute a few fabrics there. So I laid out all of my fabric and kind of got a picture of what I wanted, as well as looking on Pinterest for just like examples, trying to kind of see which dresses I liked. And I definitely liked the ones that had bigger patches over smaller patches. So that's kind of how I came to that decision, but you can honestly do it however you want. So in the pattern, it gives you the measurement for all of the skirts, the bottom tier and the top tier of the skirt. So basically what I did is I just multiplied each of those panels by 2 for the entire tube of fabric, and then I divided it by however many sections I was going to have. So the bottom tier, I just divided that width by 5 because I have 5 sections. The top tier, I divided by 4 because I'm gonna have 4 sections. And then to get the measurements for the bodice, I just measured this width here. This is like a half piece, right? Because normally you would be cutting it on the fold. And I got this width and multiplied it by 4 because the front and back bodice are basically the same width. They're within just a teeny tiny bit of each other. So if you take the front bodice and multiply that by 4, that gives you the circumference for the top tube of fabric. So I did a little math there and I cut out my rectangles. I have those all ready to go. And then the only other thing I needed was the pockets. There's 4 pocket bags that you need to cut. I just picked a random fabric for that because you're not really gonna see it. And then you need bias tape for the front neckline and for the straps. I decided to do 2 different ones. I cut my front neckline, which is piece C in the pattern, from this like florally fabric. And then I'm gonna make my own bias tape for the straps with this like brown and black gingham fabric. I'm like 99% sure about this fabric. I might swap it out for something lighter, but we'll see when we get to that point. So basically I just have a million rectangles that I've cut out for all the different tiers and bodice of the dress. And what I'm going to do to attach them is I'm going to sew them together with my serger. And if you don't have a serger, that's totally fine. You can straight stitch them together. Just make sure you're finishing the seam allowance so it doesn't fray on the inside. But I'm going to connect all of mine with the serger. So the bottom tier, I'm just gonna sew all 5 of those panels together in one big tube. And then the top tier of the skirt, I'm going to sew together like 2 panels for the front and 2 panels for the back because I need to put the pockets in. And adding the pockets is exactly the same as it's outlined in the pattern. And then once the pockets are in, I will attach the front and back together, so I'll have a tube of fabric there. And then for the bodice, I will be sewing together a front and back panel as well, but it's like 2/3 width and the 1/3 width. I'm gonna stitch that along this vertical seam here, and then I'll fold it in half to cut out the bodice, which I'll show you in a second. So yeah, super duper easy. I'm gonna jump into it, and the rest of the construction is basically the same as the pattern. Before I attached my rectangles together to create my patchwork, I really laid it out just to double check that everything was placed where I wanted it to be placed. And then once I felt good about the layout, I started piecing together the patchwork blocks with my serger. I chose my serger just because it's going to attach the fabric together and finish the raw edges at the same time. But you could do this a number of ways. You could do French seams instead. You could finish your raw edges separately and then attach your pieces together with your regular machine. As long as you are attaching your fabric together and finishing the raw edges somehow, you can really do this however you prefer. So I continued this process for all 5 pieces of my bottom tier of my skirt, for my front and back pieces of my middle tier of my skirt, and then I also pieced together my fabric blocks for the bodice. And here you can see the patchwork blocks I made for my front bodice. So all I'm going to do is fold that in half and then cut my pattern piece out from that patchwork fabric. And I will say I'm really happy with how the 2/3, 1/3 proportions worked out on these bodice pieces. I was kind of just winging it when I decided to do that, and I feel like they looked really nice. I'm glad I decided to break it up that way. I cut my back bodice piece exactly the same way, and then from there it was just business as usual for the construction of this dress. It's probably super obvious to you by now, if it wasn't before, that doing any sort of patchwork garment like this is 90% just creating the fabric. And don't get me wrong, that is a hugely impressive feat, but I think sometimes when we see patchwork garments, like if you see this patchwork dress finished, you're thinking, oh my gosh, that must have taken forever, that must be so difficult. And definitely takes some time, but I also think after you finish watching this video, we're both in on the little secret that it is a lot easier than it looks. So once all 3 of my birthday cake tiers were finished, I did one final layout just to double check that everything was looking how I wanted it to. I had a brief moment of panic where I thought I'd change everything, but ultimately it worked out. All right, the dress is done. So I'll give you a little look. There's the back. So just a couple things. I ended up making both the top skirt tier and the bottom skirt tier just like slightly wider than the pattern normally is, and I almost wish I would have gone even wider because I feel like it's like fairly swishy, but if I had made it even wider, I almost would have added like more panels, like more patchwork panels, and then it would have been like really flowy and big and quilty. So that could have been fun. I think I was just a little bit hesitant to make it like too huge, but now that I look at it, I feel like this looks totally fine. It doesn't look big and giant at all, so I almost could have gone bigger. And then I also lengthened it just a tad. It's like 1 inch longer than this dress normally is. The dress I feel like is a true midi, and just with the patchwork, I feel like it worked a little better to be more like maxi length. I also really love how these bindings worked out, like doing the lighter one here and then the darker bindings with the straps and the tie. One other thing, I feel like it was very helpful to constantly be laying things out on my big table as I was going, just to kind of check in with like how are the fabrics I'm imagining on the front of the bodice looking with the front of this tier and the front of the bottom, and I feel like I kind of repositioned some things and moved some things around. Because you know, when you're just laying out like the folded up fabric in like big squares, that's one thing, but actually like seeing it visually come together was helpful to kind of shift and adjust things. So I would definitely recommend doing that as much as you can throughout the process. And even still, like I do like the cohesion of how everything looks, but I almost feel like I may not have paid enough attention to the back here with these like 2 big pink sections. And I feel like it looks totally fine, but I definitely paid more attention to the front. And I may have switched a couple fabrics around if I had been paying more attention to the back. So yeah, I am really happy with it. I feel like what I'm gonna do next is I'm gonna do a patchwork that's just one long skirt and do like vertical panels instead of like squares. I wanna do like the bodice and then long kind of stripy patchwork. So I'm gonna play around with that. But I definitely think this pattern works very well for patchwork dresses if it's something that you want to try out. And if you end up making your own patchwork skyline or any other patchwork dress, tag me in it so I can see.